Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are about to start the panel called Measuring and Assessing a Rural Project's Technical Viability. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's going to be led by Dave Lampron. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the Columbia Basin Broadband Corporation. And Dave will step through introducing everyone, and everybody will talk about where they're located. Um, again, once again, we have a cross-Canada representation, so I'm very excited. Dave has been working in technology enablement roles for over 2 decades. He worked for the University of British Columbia, assisting to develop the first technology-enabled distributed medical program in the world. The purpose of the distributed medical program was to place trainees in rural areas of BC to assist in improving access to health services. It was during this project that Dave discovered the realities of the digital divide. He now leads the Broadband initiative for the Columbia Basin Trust in an effort to assist in addressing the connectivity service shortfalls in southeastern BC. I really appreciate having gotten to know Dave and the rest of the gentlemen on this panel. I look forward to it. Dave, I'm going to hand it off to you, and thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amadeo. And kudos, Amadeo, for pulling this national group together. So we're definitely going to be raising a glass to you at the end of this. As one of my co-presenters said, Amadeo saved the best looking crew for last. And we'll introduce you to that crew in a couple moments. Just before we went on, Amadeo said, okay, boys, this is the last session. Let's see some fireworks. And so we all said, well, careful what you ask for, Amadeo. So what you see in the panel presentation as a topic may be expanded upon by the panelists. So I guess that's just sort of a pre-warning. But first, a little bit about where I'm calling in from. So I'm calling in from southeastern British Columbia, in an area called the West Kootenay, or more broadly, the Columbia Basin area. And I'm calling you from Nelson, British Columbia. We're right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, and it's the traditional territory and unceded territories of the Sinixt people and the Ktunaxa people. I'm going to introduce my bandmates because I really liked where Amadeo and Jason went this morning around Jason's jazz drumming aspirations. We're going to try to play some music together. And as Amadeo said, this is a live setting. So the best kind of music is when you improv and you do things live. So I'm going to let Barry, Grant, Kirby, and Reza jam a little bit. And I'm going to try to get in between to kind of make sure that we somewhat stay on key. But before introducing my bandmates, I wanted to introduce this topic a little bit, and I wanted to tell you what we're going to talk about. I'll be less eloquent than my bandmates will, but you know, the panel topic is called Measuring and Assessing a Rural Project's Technical Viability. On behalf of my bandmates, I'd say that actually really what the panel should be called is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's really about ensuring that from a digital divide perspective, that we have the necessary knowledge to solve our problems, both nationally, provincially, and locally. If you can size out the dimensions and the parameters of the challenge, you're better placed. So we're trying to size out this elephant. How big is this elephant? And so what do we mean by measuring and managing? There's different components, and that may connote different things for many of the audience members, but they're questions like, what's the state of the digital divide nationally? Do we really know what that is? Do we really know what the state of the digital divide is provincially? Do you know what it is within your own community? The CRTC says that the cost of the divide nationally is somewhere around $7 billion with a B dollars. Is that the correct number, or is the gap perhaps even larger than that? Is the data sets that we've been using provincially and federally really accurate? Are there more impartial data sources out there? How do you know what your community needs to enable better connectivity? What's that gap? how do provincial and federal granting programs know that their programs have been delivered and that they're delivering benefits over the long term? And how are the benefits of publicly funded broadband projects measured over the lifetime? So those are just some of the samplings of some areas that we might get into. And it's not just about sort of one measurement. It's really sort of a broad set of measurements over a longitudinal period. So without further ado, enough Dave, but I want to introduce some of my bandmates, and Amadeo's done it nationally again. So we've got Dave on the west side and we've got Barry on the east side. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Barry Gander, who's the VP and co-founder of Viability. Barry, tell us a bit about yourself, why you're here, and a little bit about what you're going to speak about.
The 60-second version of Barry Gander, which I'm assured is the best version, is that I've been in this game for 30 years now, from projects like the billion-dollar Bell build in Saudi Arabia, where I lived for many years, to small micro networking projects, and I've had a lot of fun doing all of them. I think the most fun I'm having now in Nova Scotia is putting in rural networks, because you can see the impact that technology makes on the lives of the people. And the small iValley organization, a not-for-profit organization, pulls together the people and the companies and the technologies. And that's how I get to meet really neat people like my colleagues on this panel. So enough. Thank you.
Great stuff, Barry. Thanks so much. Next on the panel, we've got Grant Street, and Grant is the IPT Internet Performance Test Product Manager for the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, or also called CRRA. So Grant, an introduction, please.
So I like to say, when I was a puppy, I started out as a winch boy on a tower crew. And since then, I've successfully built, expanded, and upgraded telecommunication networks all over the world. So I started literally at the bottom. It was the bottom of the tower, and slowly worked my way up those towers. Then I went back to university when I realized how much hard work it was. Today, I'm CRRA's product manager for the Internet Performance Test. CRRA has a primary focus of improving Canada's internet. We do that through a number of security products, security awareness training, public grants for innovative community internet projects, and supporting Canada's internet exchanges to keep Canadian internet traffic in Canada. You might be very surprised at how many service providers connect through exchange points in the US. The internet is one of the only things holding our economy together right now today with COVID-19. Government needs to set broadband infrastructure projects as a top priority, and they appear to be doing so. A comprehensive user-generated measurement program needs to be involved, not only to help identify the areas most in need, but also to make sure any recipients of the funding are hitting the market on QoS quality of service targets. That is to say, any government funding going towards these projects is being used to actually meet the targets laid out by ISED or the CRTC. CRRA is based as CRRA's IPT, Internet Performance Test, is that tool, we think. Thank you.
Good stuff, Grant. Thanks so much. And my next bandmate is Kirby Koster, and Kirby is the Senior Manager for the Broadband Program at the Center of Excellence for Next Generation Networks, also known as CENGEN. So Kirby, introductions, please.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for the introduction. I've been in the high-tech industry now for about 30 years, spent about 30 years on the other side of the fence as a vendor, selling everything from leased line network solutions through Newbridge Networks and optical networking solutions through Meriton Networks, as well as spending 8 years with Dragon Wave Systems, designing and field testing and implementing microwave solutions in countries around the world, from Japan to Turkey to South Africa. So, but my current role is to help drive innovation and broadband technology solutions into rural and northern communities throughout Northern Ontario and rural Ontario. So that's my focus these days. I'm a strong champion of micro projects and helping very small communities, anywhere from 100 to 300 homes per project typically, And obviously, we have a strong need to monitor and validate performance characteristics in these networks before and after we implement solutions.
Right on, Kirby. Thanks so much. And then finally, rounding out the orchestra here is Dr. Reza Bian. And Reza is a research fellow with the Ted Rogers School of Information Technology Management at Ryerson University. Reza, introductions?
Hi, nice to see you all. I'm sort of the dismal economist in the sort of in the group that you've seen for the past couple of days. My background is in competition policy and economic development. For the past 10 years, I've been focusing on telecom infrastructure development issues. And I sort of got into the broadband measurement and looking at network development because my own internet is slow. I'm talking to you from Richmond Hill, and it was slow 10 years ago, and it's breaking up now as we speak. So I've done quite a bit of research with various colleagues from Ryerson, from regional and rural broadband projects from University of Guelph, and my colleagues from Concordia University on measuring, and one of my colleagues helped bring the CRRBC test from Measurement Lab, which is a broader framework to Canada. Sort of this research has led to working with a lot of rural municipalities over the past 5-6 years. So I've been involved in some of the bigger projects in Ontario, in Nova Scotia, in Alberta, and also working with the Ontario Ministry of Infrastructure to try to sort of identify gaps and develop financial modeling strategies to try to address them. So viability is a key issue that I've been focusing on the past few years.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Reza. So why don't we dive into things? I want to remind the audience that we really want your questions and your feedback. So we've prepared a few questions to get us warmed up, but I'm going to be monitoring the question board. If you see questions that you like, vote for it, because that's probably where my attention is going to go. The more vote it gets, probably the more interest that's going to gain from your colleagues around the call. So why don't we dive into things first? And Kirby, you talked a little bit about micro projects, and for communities that are 100 to 300 households in size, how do we, how do you measure the viability to determine whether a community is a viable candidate for a publicly funded broadband project? And what are what's some of the process that you go through in the thinking that you go through to help communities in your area to assess where they are and what the viability is in terms of them jumping into a broadband project?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. I mean, it is a very difficult process sometimes to figure out which community is viable to take on a project. And we go through a great deal of effort to look at all aspects of the project in terms of how it benefits the community, how it benefits or how it can support the business case from the perspective of the technology company that's supporting it, whether that be a WISP or an ISP or a service provider of some sort or a system integrator. So we definitely need to make sure that the project is financially viable, that it can be jointly funded by both our public funding that we get as well as the private funding from the other side. So we also have to make sure that it's going to meet the needs of the community if at all possible. So there's a few things that we look for. So first of all, we have to determine whether the community has a high capacity point of presence that can be used to feed or backfeed to the internet. That's crucial. We need to know how many homes are in the particular community. We need to be able to understand the extended or expected reach around the main community and what catchment area that will allow to pick up other subscribers. And we need to be able to understand the return on investment timeframe to make sure that the project is viable, particularly if it has a wireless component to it, knowing that the wireless technology will tend to be replaced every 3 to 5 years. We really would like to see a return on investment less than 5 years if there's a wireless component. If it's an optical component, obviously the return on investment can be longer. But the key part, once we've taken all of those considerations into effect, the other part is to validate using measurement tools what the actual current internet access performance is for the community in general. And oftentimes, many of these rural and remote communities only have the hot spotting off their cellular network, satellite access services, or very, very poor low capacity wireless access. So those can be quickly validated with tools like CRRA is offering, and very effectively displayed and communicated both to the community and to funding partners to clearly show the need in the community. Once we've done that and we've installed a new solution into the community, it's very critical that right after that's done, and as it's deployed, that we can validate the performance criteria is being met by the service provider and assure the community that in fact this new service is meeting the objectives and the performance requirements specified in the project. So that's where it's absolutely key to have tools like the IPT from CRRA, the Internet Performance Tool, that will allow us to validate that and graphically show in a very clear way how it's used. And the important part is that these tools are very, very easy to use so that the end subscribers can use it with minimal or limited technical expertise.
Great, Kirby. And I'm glad that you went to the economics side of things and talked about sort of the different rates of return on investment, because those will vary depending on the constructs of a community, population density, existing infrastructure. One of the hallmarks, I think, of rural broadband projects is that the investment horizon needs to be much longer than traditional carriers tend to use in terms of evaluating whether something is feasible from a business case standpoint. But I thought we'd go over to our lowly economist, Reza, because I think that Kirby's point on the economics, I think, is a good segue. You know, one of the things that we talked about before we got the panel together was around sort of this notion of traditionally grant, supports things like fixed costs. But the economics are such that in many rural areas that we need to be thinking about the variable costs as well. And you also talked a little bit about the financial viability and the technical viability are interrelated. So for instance, everyone wants to put fiber everywhere, but is that really economically feasible in most rural areas? So maybe Reza, could you take us through your thought process with the economics and expand on some of those points?
Sure. Thank you. I'll build actually on some of what Kirby was saying about micro projects, because that's a challenge in terms of viability of projects that a lot of smaller projects have been running into for the past few years. And that's a viability in terms of scalability and enabling cross subsidies from sort of larger population clusters into very smaller ones. So, and this has been remains a challenge, whether you are using very targeted subsidies on the very narrow edges of the network, which are very high cost. And as you said, it would be very challenging to cover the variable cost, even if you have 100% fixed cost subsidy. And that is one thing that the rural broadband programs haven't really thought about, is that if you are very much targeting the extra high cost, low return edges of the network, very small communities, the variable cost can build up, and so you need sort of sustained support. And as, for example, CRTC is phasing out the local service subsidy on old copper networks right now and transitioning to the broadband funding, a lot of smaller incumbents that have relied on that in rural areas are challenged. So that's one aspect of it. And this connects back to mapping and the dreaded hex. Oh, sorry. I'll be quiet because I have audio issues. So why don't we go to somebody else? Is it better now? No.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Thanks, Reza. Almost an irony in terms of where you are from an urban setting. But maybe I'll pass the mic back to you, but maybe what we'll do is we'll pause your video when I do pass the mic back to you, and that seemed to work this morning. So actually, why don't you try that again, Reza, and just kind of keep on going. I think the audio was mostly understandable, but give it a try without your video.
Okay, is it better now? Can you hear?
I think it is. Give it a try.
Okay, so this connects back to the issue of hexagons that we discussed. A lot of the approach at the federal level has been to target these very narrow areas in the hexagons that nobody, not even one person, has access to those services. And you've heard a lot about it over the years, that this is problematic because it underestimates or underestimates the size of the gaps. But from a economic viability perspective, that underestimation of the gaps leaves out a lot of the larger population clusters in the middle. And that actually negatively impacts your ability to attract complementary private sector funding, and by putting together larger projects. So that is a significant challenge for very remote and rural areas.
Thanks, Reza. And I think, one of the things that you mentioned to us yesterday is that as larger population areas within rural geographic areas are being served, it creates a sort of a hinterland in the kind of the rural and remote areas, which creates a very difficult market for the smaller ISPs and the wireless ISPs. So we're sort of, there's a time crunch to this issue that is not just based on we need to get Canadians better connectivity, but there's also a time crunch in relation to market relevance in terms of, what's the market opportunity for serving some of those small areas. If they're too small, there just isn't a viable market there. I want to take the question over to Barry on the other side of the province in the right time zone. And Barry, I wonder, you talked a little bit about, ways to measure the technical viability of an entire project over its lifespan. Can you expand a little bit on that? What do you mean over that lifespan, and how do you do it?
Thanks very much, Dave. And this is so interesting to us. What we're seeing here, of course, is a set of interlocked technology steps that lead up to a technical feasibility of a project. We're really in the start of the next wave of communications, though we have to realize that, as people have been emphasizing throughout this conference, it's not about the traditional telco ROI anymore. We're talking about a community value network, which is very, very different. I don't know whether you can see anything behind me there on the wall, but there's a plaque that is a certification from the World Council on City Data of the world's first ISO gold standard for a smart rural region. And we won that for our clients here in the Annapolis Valley, measuring 100 different values, from healthcare to education, to the network itself, to traffic, and so on, with depths of understanding in each one of them. That is really a good place for people to start, to say, what value is a network to our community? If you wanted to go to the WCCD site and take a look at their values and listings, that will tell you what a network is worth to a community. And that really is how you measure the technology viability, because viability just means how valuable is it to the subject that you're dealing with. When we're starting our own projects, for example, we like to give our clients, our municipalities rather, a choice. We come in at the ground level with the very fine-grained ICT, at least a CIRA IPT model. In one of our communities, for example, we blanketed the place for many, many months with getting people to do that test. It's all about that communication, as people would be saying, and the mantra is, make it impossible for people not to know. And we had so many good records from that testing that we were able to submit the results to the CTI funding program, and that enabled us to get $9 million from the federal government, which was more than everybody else in the entire province put together for the funding of that particular piece of network. And that, to me, and you're not going to be sending me an invoice, Grant, by the way, on that, that to me was absolutely worth knowing, because it was fine-grained measurement of a performance of a network in a community. Now we have a benchmark. Everybody can see the value of it. We have a goal, the WCCD goal, and between then and now, we can put in the network according to the buildup of a high-performance plan, a high network model, And the various options we then present to a municipality to say, if you go here, it'll cost you this. If you do that, it'll cost you that. And then it's up to the municipality to make its choice. As you heard from our colleagues in Pictou this morning, they started off saying, we'll go with the lower priced version with the a lot of Wi-Fi wireless going on, but they eventually changed to high fiber, a fiber rich environment, because they could see that was the future, and they're moving that way. But the point is to give them the choices all along the way and make sure that it's not bounded by a telco's 3 to 5 year ROI, because that's absolutely false for a rural community. And I would suggest that there's not a rural community in this country that can't fund its own network by itself. If you look at it over 20 years, you're looking at a utility model. And that's a strong statement. And you know, we're happy to connect people with financing sources as well. But if you look at the ability of a community, no matter how sparsely populated, to pay for something over a long, long period of time that would give a telco a heart attack, it can be done. And that, I think, is a summary, Dave, of our experience.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. And there's some of the fireworks that Amadeo had asked us for. And I think that's something for the communities that are listening to think about in terms of sort of that payback period and what it is that you're truly investing in. Barry, I thought you did a great job of just kind of bookending having a goal, but then having a baseline to know where you are when you start on that journey towards achieving the goal. So yeah, so thanks for that. I want to turn the mic over to Grant for him to jam a little bit. And then I'm going to go to some of the questions that are just starting to pop up, and they're great. So there's a few really killer ones in there. Grant, you know, many of the communities that are on the call right now have probably experienced this scenario, which is, hey, we want to apply for an ISED grant or CRTC or provincial grant. And then when they have a look at some of the mapping information and the eligibility information, in some cases, they're shocked to find out that the community that they want to apply for is either not eligible or at least partially not eligible with the hexagon process. Can you share your perspectives a little bit on you know, user reported data and quality of data and the measurement of true service quality in you know, across Canada?
Sure. So there are several stages of a project, sorry. There's the pre-qualification phase, which is where all this mapping comes in, and we do all the measuring that kind of says, well, here's the real need. And CRRA is working with ISED to gather information on testing all across Canada. We've done about 680,000 tests, and so that's your pre-qualification of where we are today across Canada. And there's huge gaps, and CRRA has been publishing some articles about that. Then there's progress reporting, because once the project kicks off, you got to jump on it and you got to start measuring it right away. If you leave it to the very end, you're risking having a potential disaster of nothing meeting the spec. Whereas if you monitor it as you go, then you'll know that the ISP or whoever is meeting the requirements right from day one. Then there's the final implementation report. That comes at sort of at the end. The CRTC defines that as being when you've finished all the construction and you filed for all of your money, which they hold back 10% of. So that final implementation report should prove that you've met the requirements. The holdback report comes 1 year later. Once you finish the project, you get a holdback report, and you file that to prove that a year later, you're still meeting those requirements. Well, the only way you can prove that they're still meeting the requirements is if you have a performance test that measures, you know, upload, download, jitter, latency, and packet loss, and all those other neat things. And everybody thinks that that's it. At the end of it all, we're all done. Well, there's two other components in here. There's a scalability issue, because they may grant a project some funding that meets 25/5 as opposed to 50/10. And so now you've got to they'll grant that money based on the ISP guaranteeing that they will bring the network up to the 50-10 requirements using their own money within 5 years. So that thing goes on for 5 years, that you've got to, they've got to still continue to upgrade their networks, and you've got to hold them accountable for that. And then there's the ongoing annual State of the Internet report that comes out from CRTC and others. ISED probably has their own version of it, where everybody says this is where rural internet, well, Canadian internet is today. And to do that, we have to measure, and we have to provide those reports, and we have to continue to hold people accountable. There are too many examples of projects where we just didn't ask them to do that, or we use Ookla or something like that just for, test the local performance as opposed to a real life performance. And, they weren't held accountable, and the networks are still not performing very well. And we've got to stop making that mistake and get together so that every single level of government funding, be it federal, provincial, or municipal, all use the same database, the same mapping software, so that every Canadian can go to that report. It's public. You can go to CRRA right now and click on that map, and you can see how your own internet is. And it's there's nothing hidden. It's all straight up forward, and you can see it for yourself. And you can follow all these projects as they go. And I think that's how we got to do it.
Thanks so much, Grant. And that's certainly something I think that, those of us who are in the community, hear back from our constituents, from our citizens around what is their true experience, right? And so this notion of getting a crowdsourced understanding of their experience, I'll editorialize, I think, is the most important data set. Is tell us as a Canadian how things are. And we can marry other data sets, but to me, that's the nugget. So I want to have a look at the questions, and there's some real doozies in there. So we're, I think, really warmed up as a conference. I'm going to start with one, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Reza in a second here. Reza, this is a question from Brian. And Brian asks, is there any economic lessons that we can take from rolling out electricity in rural Canada decades ago that can be applied to the rollout of broadband?
Yeah, the basic lesson, and it goes again back to the viability, is that market failures happen not because the costs are too high or the revenue too little. It's because people cannot capture that positive value that comes from building these networks. And they call it economics positive spillovers. So I think with COVID, a lot of people are realizing, like a few years ago, you had wireless, you were only using email and simple web browsing, maybe that would have been enough. But past few months, I think that question of, it's only rural areas, it deserves to be bad because they chose to live there, that argument is not going to cut it anymore, and we hear that a lot. But that lesson that, so imagine it in terms of the quality of life, allowing older people to sort of live independently in their homes in rural areas if they have monetary and security that internet enables. So, and it's that capturing that positive economic and social value that's hard to do. And the best way of, I know we have lots of municipalities here, and I just want to mention this, to sort of cut through the chase and simplify this from a financial perspective, is to look at it in terms of property value in terms of property values, because that's an indicator that allows you to better understand how much different people around you that you don't even know value your community. And that translates directly in your ability to feed into other sort of social and business infrastructure services that you need. So that is the key lesson from the history, I guess. And the basic economics are the same, right?
Thanks so much, Reza. So lots of nuggets in that one. And, you know, this notion of, oh, well, you live in a rural area, so you should settle for less service. I think the electrical equivalent to that would be, well, okay, well then a 10 amp service to your home is good enough, right? So you have to unplug your toaster to use your microwave, to unplug to use your light. I don't think anyone would say that's good enough. And I think that's sort of a direct comparator. I want to take another question, and this one I'm going to throw over to you, Kirby, because I would imagine that you've run into this a few times, especially with some of your what you call micro projects. How do we square the service targets with remote communities that have zero or low connectivity and appear to be excluded from funding based on meeting the 50-10 criteria?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we're seeing in a lot of these rural communities, and that's where I think there are some challenges for some of these communities that are, sometimes 20, 30, 40 or 50 kilometers apart, right? And that isn't just in Northern Ontario, that's in Southwestern Ontario and other places like that, where there isn't a high concentration of hamlets and villages and small towns. They're really dispersed, far rural communities and small agribusinesses and that sort of thing, as well and in Northern Ontario. So what we see in some of these townships, they only have a tax revenue of about $5 million a year. So it's really, really difficult for them to even take on a long 20-year term loan situation and take on a $20 or $40 million fiber optic large scale community owned project. So, I think there's still certain communities where absolutely, if we could group 20 or 30 of these little small communities together, it would be viable, but it's very difficult to get that much municipal consensus for one thing. It takes these projects sometimes 3 to 5 years to gel and get the funding and move forward on. So sometimes small micro projects can be much more effective in helping these communities get a short-term solution that'll get them real broadband connectivity.
Thanks so much, Kirby. I want to go to our question board again because there's some real doozies here. And Barry, I might lean on you for this one. I think any of the panelists can participate in this. So Barry, you'll get the first right of refusal on answering the question. And if any of the panelists want to chime in, just give me a hand. So this one's kind of near and dear to me as well, and talks a little bit about what the panels talked about yesterday around this highway analogy. And the notion of, well, if the Trans-Canada Highway was privatized, then we'd have to build a bunch more. And there'd be a toll system for the Trans-Canada, and we'd be in this process of building numerous highways when we only really needed that one highway. So the question's from Stan, and Stan asks, how do we get the federal government to have a look at the use of dark fiber from the large carriers and to stop the unnecessary duplication of fiber builds in rural communities? So Barry, over to you.
Thank you, and it's a crucial question too. I think the history of building a public way has evolved. The old days of the railroad and the beginning of the telephone system were in days when the government would sell that right to a private company. And then the road system came along after the phone, in fact, after the phone, and it was a public domain. It was recognized to be, you only need one road. You don't need a separate road for GM and another road for Ford. And that became the model of the network today, as it is evolving, I think, successfully elsewhere. And that is what the federal government, well, all governments have to realize, is that you only need one pipe and everybody can use the pipe. It's got to be totally open access for everybody. And if you do that, then you're copying the best in the world. People seem to think that these rural networks are going to be somehow inferior to the urban networks, or at least a publicly funded network or publicly planned network is going to be inferior. That's not the case. The Intelligent Community Forum in New York has been giving out most intelligent community awards for the last 20 years, and not one of those awards has gone to an organization that was built by a telco. They've all been built by either a municipal government or a public government, like the city of Chattanooga. And the difference is in that 20-year funding cycle. You don't have to cut your equipment costs off of what's going to pay off in 3 to 5 years. You've got an open horizon. So in fact, the publicly funded networks are the best. And if you can apply that model, which is why I really like that question, if you can apply that model across the whole country, Canada will once again have a stellar communications network, because this is our century. I mean, the telephone was invented here. The telephone patent was fought for here in Canada. The world's first domestic communications satellite was Canadian. And second, it goes on, but and I'm sorry I'm ranting up, but the basic idea is I love your question, and we really have to push that public notion on the federal government and others. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, I think you're underscoring that this is a nation-building paradigm, and that analogy with the telephone, electricity, and different innovations is kind of we're on that same wavelength. Reza, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to be more specifically on the question of dark fiber. For those of you who were around in Amadeo's in-person conference last time in Newmarket, I emphasized it a lot, and Mayor Thompson from Caledon and various others emphasized it, and CRRBC opened the proceeding that submissions have just closed, but they are considering opening access, potentially opening access to dark fiber, lit fiber services in rural areas. So it's a little too late to contribute to the process for the audience, but the question is in play and in the hands of the commission.
Can I riff on that question a little bit more? If that access was opened up, I'm going to make a statement. You can support it or refute it. And Grant, I'm going to give you first right of refusal on answering the question. If dark fiber from the large incumbents was opened up, would that start, in your view, would that start to fast track the solutioning the rural connectivity divide?
It's not a silver bullet, but transport capacity is the key bottleneck for a lot of small rural broadband projects, and you have to duplicate it, even let's say in Alberta where there's SuperNet, or on Northern Ontario, I don't know how much Amadeo can tell us better. The government spent hundreds of millions of dollars in developing fiber network, but a lot of the small communities Kirby is trying to build to right now, fiber goes by them, but they can't get access. And the difference between light and dark fiber in this context is very important for developing high capacity access networks. Because if you're regulating lit fiber and buying that, as soon as you improve your access network, usage is going to go up. And the cost of your backhaul are going to go up if you're buying lit. Whereas if you have dark fiber, you can scale it at much lower cost. So, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything, but it is a key bottleneck.
Grant, did you want to jump in there? Grant, you're muted. There you go.
Okay. So it's interesting because one of our marketing guys, Josh Tavish, he commented on the highway comparison, like he came up with it on his own in a conversation we were having, saying, if you've got the 401, you can choose the kind of car you want to drive. It can be a Volkswagen, a Lamborghini, or a pedal car. But if you've only got a dirt road, you start to limit your choices, and it's very real. So we have to give the same ability right across Canada, and the only way to do that is to build a network, a cross Canada network, and make sure that we hold people accountable for providing the services that they're getting funded for, and we need to do that at all levels of government. I'm kind of a broken record there, I know.
Well, Grant, I want to let you riff a little bit more, so you get a guitar solo if that's, or flute solo. Are you flautist?
No.
Helen asks, how can we make use of bigger and big data for strengthening rural broadband planning and measurement? And what do you think about efforts to establish better repositories?
So, and big data is the key. We've got 680,000 tests that we've run so far. I wish we had 2,680,000 tests. And, we really have to encourage everybody to be running tests so that we really know and understand the capacity and the capability of existing networks all across Canada. So, that's the reason that I said reach out to us, is they wanted to, collect some different information in their own way. And that proves or is part of our record, our historic record. And it does clearly show, using metadata and other methods, that there's a lot to be done. We have the self-reported data that comes from the internet service providers and the telcos, and it indicates, you know, certain service levels. But when we compare that to the tests that we actually collect, it doesn't always, you know, meet those requirements. And, you know, it, in the rural internet, 5.1 and 10.2 are kind of the basic packages. And if you get 5.1, you're sort of going to be able to do some things. 10.2, you probably can hold conversations and everything else. But if you're supposed to get 5.1 and you only get 3 down and 0.5 up, I mean, now you're almost dial up, and now you're going to struggle. And, you know, you're not going to be able to, you know, use a VoIP phone. You're not going to be able to join the Internet of Things. You're just not going to be able to do it. So we really need to get everybody on board and to get all of the internet service providers and telcos to use one common tool that collects all the data for all the provinces, all the rural areas, right across Canada. And then we need to act on that data. And, you know, we can all watch it. We can actually go onto the CRRBC website, look at that map, and we can watch those ugly red dots start to change color into, you know, serviceable internet. And everybody can see it.
Thanks, Barry. And for those of you who are not familiar with the CRRBC tool, there is a document handout in the conference app, and so I encourage you to have a look at it. Many of our communities have actually subscribed to a portal where we can access data about our communities, where we can basically look at, you know, where we need to focus attention. Kirby, I want to send you a question. This one's from Carrie Ann. And she asks, can't we improve project viability from both a technical and financial perspective by aggregating smaller projects into larger regional initiatives? And I think in some ways you already answered the question in terms of how challenging that is. But maybe can you expand on that a little bit in terms of, you know, you've talked about micro projects could be more nimble, but can you expand on the challenges of basically trying to herd the cat, so to speak, and try to get sort of scale and projects?
Yeah, I think we've had some pretty good experience in that regard. Typically, our projects are anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million kind of projects. We've got a couple of examples already in our. We've done about 5 projects, and we're finding that we've got 2 or 3 that have multiple phases associated with them. So typically, the funding levels that we have, we can only do the first phase. So the other phases are based on the concept that the technology solutions that we support and promote and drive typically are cookie cutter solutions. So they could be taken and applied to subsequent phases. So for example, in the Parry Sound area, we have a project in Carling Township, just north of Parry Sound, where we have a project. But there's 6 other townships surrounding Parry Sound in the West Parry Sound district that have similar needs and are severely underserved, as the CRRBC tool rightly shows. These projects are, you know, equally serviceable using a very similar approach to what we used in our project. It happened to be a microwave extension from the town of Parry Sound out to the first community. And then we used a fiber to the home solution once we got there, and then a fixed wireless solution to support homes up to 10 kilometers around that area with at least better services than what they had. And be able to do microwave hop extensions to other townships and other communities, industrial parks and other things around the area is possible. And it doesn't take huge amounts of funding, right? It takes in the order of $500,000 to $700,000 to make a significant difference. It may not support the entire community or the entire township, but it could support at least parts of the community that are severely underserved and have higher concentrations of populations. But all of these townships, like I was saying earlier, typically have very small tax bases, right? Because most of the residents there are, the permanent residents are very small in number and highly dispersed. They do have summer populations that come in that have higher concentrations, but it's for very short periods of time, typically. So it's a very difficult environment to get better services to. But yes, if you could get all of them together, and that's typically what's happening in this community, they do have an organization that's helping to bring all the needs of the communities, separate communities together and trying hard to either support them piecemeal or as a group. They've been trying for over 8 years to get enough funding to support all of the communities as a group, and they gave up. So, I mean, they didn't give up. They're still trying, but it's been very difficult to do. That's why the micro projects are succeeding for them.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby. And I want to flag the time. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and you know, as Amadeo says, like we can riff on these things for an entire day. I want to throw this over to my brother over on the East Coast there, Barry. And this is kind of in the same vein. I know a lot of people on the call are, hey, we're a small community. We've got the same needs, but we don't really have the capacity for planning and grant writing. How do we ensure that small communities across Canada are not excluded from the federal and provincial grants? What's your perspective on that?
A lot of words have been said about there's no cookie cutter solution, but there is a cookie cutter process. And we'd be happy to, in fact, I think Dave, you and I have spoken about putting together that cookie cutter process and making that available based on the experiences you've had on the West Coast and you've had on the East Coast, bookending Canada, as it were, with that. And we can certainly work together to make that available to everybody publicly. I might add that this issue with the smaller communities is hurt a lot more by the fact that we don't actually have a communication strategy in this country. What we've got are funding competitions, which pit little communities against each other. They break up the country more than they pull it together. You know, if somebody were to go into, say, Kirby's area and say, we have this amount of money, here's the plan, here's the network, and here's what we're going to do, that would be proactive. That would be almost like an Australian solution, which we deserve to have here. But I noticed that everybody's giving a thumbs up, so I take it that I'll stop talking and let people carry on with other subjects.
No, the thumbs up was both agreeing with your points, Barry, and Amadeo's according us a few extra minutes. So if you didn't want to truncate your thoughts there, so please make sure you finish. That's really
a dangerous thing to say, but I think I'll turn it back over to my colleagues to carry on.
Well, I wonder if Reza, if you want to jump in terms of, again, that notion of capacity and rural communities who are like, well, we can see these programs out there, but boy, we're so busy trying to solve the problems that are already on our list. Adding another problem to it is going to overflow our plate. What are your thoughts there?
Well, in some way you need scaling, and the fact that and this needs to be done at the upper tiers of government. For example, developing a sort of a universal broadband fund that cross-subsidizes from low-cost urban centers to rural areas, but we haven't gone there that much. So the universal broadband fund that we have coming out is not a cross-subsidy. To make it sustainable, it's basically a tax distribution. So that's and that you can enable scaling. So what a lot of people have been doing, as you said, the traditional funding model has been very small communities and targeted funding, but people in Eastern and Western Ontario, for example, have managed to come together because they realized that that doesn't really work, and they've developed regional networks. But that has its own challenges. But one key thing to developing scaling is having minimum service quality standards, not just for broadband that publicly subsidized funding mechanisms. You need to have them in general, in the sense that we also had them for the telephone system that evolved by having some quality of service standards for the voice call. And this is where we're going to have to go over the longer term in terms of generalizing this beyond funding towards standards. That sort of the minimum, and by standards here, I mean minimum standards rather than these aspirational targets based on best effort that everybody knows are sort of not achievable, but they're there as a long-term target. And they don't need to substitute for each other. They can be complements. You can have the aspiration and also the minimum standard.
Yeah, Grant, please come on in.
Yeah, so, you know, we've been looking, Sarah has been looking at all of the press announcements coming out. And we've done a bunch ourselves. And we're really pleased to see that Minister Monsef is announcing that any day now they're going to release the Universal Broadband Fund. They're also preparing to launch an online portal where communities can track the progress of broadband infrastructure projects from the Globe and Mail on May 25th. And I guess I have just a small concern that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And we want to make sure that we utilize things like the Internet Performance Test and its capabilities in any kind of a tool that is out there for people to use. You know, the CRTC has indicated that a third-party independent test capability is, going through a tier one internet, a tier one city connection is what we should be using as a standard. So that's what we do. I mean, that's our whole tool is based on the CRTC requirements. So we want to see the CRTC and ISED and the rural economic people all get together and put something together that's not just unique for every application within their own areas, but that is universally prepared and operated so that everybody in Canada can see what's going on, how the money's being spent, where it's being spent, and what the impact is on the internet in Canada. And we think that's just critical. Would almost like to see Minister Monsef say, hey, you know what, we're going to include IPT when we make our funding announcement, but maybe that's asking too much.
So, maybe one last question, and maybe I'll pick on Kirby. Are the roles of government clear right now? If you look at the federal government, what's its role in assisting and solving with the provincial governments, plural, and then municipal and county or regional district? Are those clear, and could they use some clarification?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is becoming more and more challenging, even for organizations like ourselves, to try and make sure we don't step on anybody else's toes or do any double dipping in terms of government funding of projects, right? So every community that we assess, we have to go through that minefield of figuring out what other federal or provincial programs may they already be taking advantage of or applying for or close to being approved for, so that we don't inadvertently fund a project that's in an area that's already about to receive a significant amount of funding from another funding program. So it is a challenge for us to make sure that we are independently funding projects that are not in areas that are already about to receive a significant amount of funding, so that we don't be perceived as over-servicing one area over another. So it is very challenging because a lot of the government departments don't openly share their programs until after they're approved. So by that time, it's too late. We may have already beat them to the punch because typically ours come up very quickly.
Thanks, Kirby. Again, we can go on, and the questions have just been fantastic. But our esteemed leader and host is coming back on. I want to thank my bandmates, Barry, Grant, Kirby, and Reza. It's been great to hang out with you in preparation and great conversation here today. I've learned a lot. Before I hand things back to Amadeo, I want to say on behalf of the conference participants and folks who have had some tiny glimpse behind the scenes of how much you've worked to pull this whole thing together, my friend, you deserve a week's worth of sleep and several glasses of wine at the end of this. And I think you're highlighting, certainly for me, I won't speak for all of the delegates, but highlighting the national imperative that we have here. And it's just amazing that you've pulled people together from all walks across the country, representing all of our diversity, geographic, cultural diversity. And so thank you, Amadeo, for pulling us together. So greatly appreciated. So back over to you, our gracious host.
Well, thanks, Dave. Thanks for the super kind words. You're actually making me blush. I was far too kind. It really does come down to, all you panelists that really pulled together. And I want to thank you to the team for rounding out this conference. I think this discussion has been critically important, and especially in light of the funding rounds. Dave, I have to say, I really appreciate your reference to a band all through the presentation, all through the session. All of you over the past 2 days have been rock stars for having devoted your time to prepare and then be part of this event on really short notice. By the way, everyone, you don't need to leave the session to rejoin my closing remarks. We're just keeping the stream live for the last few minutes. And bittersweet, it does mark the end of this virtual conference. It's been quite an experience. Over these past 2 days, we've engaged in the very complex issue of rural and remote broadband that our speakers have courageously tackled. And in this last session, we heard the statement that we need to move beyond the ROI of private service providers and to start looking at the value broadband brings to communities. Tied to this, the first panel, I thought it was a great question that came from the Q&A. What would you do differently if you could go back in time? And the replies were, increase collaboration, coordinate builds, take the risk, and just build it. I think those are powerful statements. Many of us have heard this one over the years too, and again, it just came out of the last panel. You live in a rural area, that's your choice. You should settle for lesser service, that's good enough. Well, as was stated, that's not going to cut it anymore. Minister Monsef provided the Government of Canada's perspective to start the conference off. And then we tried to take a deeper dive into the issues and the hurdles while sharing experiences and potential solutions, especially in light of COVID-19. I want you to remember that you can reach out to all the speakers and the sponsors directly if you have more questions or want to contact them. There's a lot of great documentation and information they've posted, and certainly more to come. I really want to thank my sponsors for their support and making this conference a reality, again, on short notice. Calix has stood behind me in my efforts to broaden our rural ecosystem from the start, so a special thank you to them. Finally, none of this would have been possible or run so smoothly if it wasn't for the expertise and talent of my main team, my two guys in the background, Jordan Sullivan and Alex Bernardi. A litmus as to the success, I think, of the message the panelists had are the facts that in breaks, Jordan and Alex engage me in discussion and we talk about the issues. And I think that's amazing. And I know this will move forward and pay forward. Over the past 48 hours, it's been a blur. I've been asked about what's next and will there be a follow-up conference? So yes, there will be. As mentioned, the in-person ones have been postponed for 2020, but I will be announcing the next virtual conference soon and working with this great group and stakeholders to make sure we bring, again, great information and viable content to you. So I just want to close off again by saying thank you. Thank you to all the attendees, all the panelists, speakers, the team. And I hope you all keep well and bid you adieu. Thank you, everyone.